All right, well, thanks everybody. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Who Took My Cookie? Driving Inquiries in a Changing Digital Landscape. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us. I hope this is a good use of your time. And please feel free to pass along the webinar recording. If you like it, we'll be emailing it out afterwards. So everybody who registered, please feel free to pass that along to your colleagues if you find this content valuable, and I hope you do. So just as a reminder, this is part 3 in a 4-part webinar series we're doing. It's titled Reprecedented, and the idea behind the series is simply that we're really trying to use these webinars as a way to focus on addressing some of the really big challenges in selling place-based residential education during the pandemic. We have had 2 fantastic webinars up to this point. We had Sarah Cohen from Transylvania University and Gareth Fowles from Lynn University join us on the first webinar. They had both had record-breaking classes this past year, but they talked about kind of some of the factors that contributed to it, and most importantly, how they're viewing the year ahead. It was really interesting, very smart enrollment leaders. Last week, we had Jeff Calais, who is, I think, one of the leading, if not the leading visit experts, talking with May Waters at Sewanee University about their visit program. And Sewanee has an amazing visit program. I think probably one of the more dialed in visit programs you're going to find anywhere. And so they had a fantastic conversation, and May really, I think, sort of pulled back the curtain on a lot of things they're doing quite well, and just had some really, I think, fantastic insights to share with the audience. So I think those, if you missed those, it would be well worth your time to go back and check those out. So today we're going to be talking about digital advertising. In the next week, we'll be talking about engaging with parents. And so it should be a really fantastic series, and I hope you'll continue to join us. So on with today's show, my name is Jared Smith. I'm the VP of Strategy at Echo Delta. For those of you who are not familiar with Echo Delta, we provide marketing and enrollment consulting services for smaller schools around the country. So to find out more about what we do, please feel free to head on over to echodelta.co, and you can check that out. So thank you if you do. So enough sort of self-promotional plugging, I suppose. Let's dive in. And you may be sort of wondering if this webinar series is about promoting place-based education. Why are we talking about digital advertising in this webinar series? So I really think there are 2 answers for that. The first one is that if you are a tuition-driven institution, which I think most likely most of us on the call are, and those of us who are promoting place-based education, most of us are, chances are good that you rely, at least in part, on effective digital advertising to drive your inquiries and ultimately your apps and enrollments. So I think that's kind of part 1. Part 2, I think, is a little bit bigger picture, which is that all the data and experience that we have as marketers indicates that Gen Z doesn't really differentiate between online and offline experiences the way that previous generations were more likely to sort of differentiate. So for them, the college search process in large part starts online, and it's really all kind of one seamless experience for them. Even sort of the most visceral, physically grounded component of our recruitment process, which is the visit, even that is going to start online at a bare minimum with some sort of online registration form, but also likely through the media that they're consuming and perhaps some advertisements that they've been exposed to that are going to be driving that interest. And May Waters over at Sewanee, talked about this last week when she was talking about the virtual tour, sort of in relationship to their physical tour, and how students are not viewing that as a one-to-one replacement, but they are very complementary, and one kind of feeds the other. So interesting stuff there. But for those 2 reasons, I think that this is probably a very highly relevant topic. So for today, here's what we're going to cover. We're going to talk about sort of the current digital marketing landscape, where are we at today. Then we're going to take a look at some things that are just around the corner that I think you should probably be prepared for. And then lastly, we're going to spend some time looking at some recommendations, some very tactical things, but then also some bigger picture, more holistic sort of things to help guide the effectiveness of your digital campaigns moving forward. So as always, we do have a Q&A feature here. So if you see that in Zoom and want to make use of it, by all means do so. And I'll do my best to keep tabs on what's coming in through Q&A. So let's jump in. So first, the current landscape. So I think if you've been following digital advertising developments at all, you've definitely heard a lot of commotion over the past year around privacy and sort of the big tech players, Google, Apple, and Facebook. We're going to spend some time looking in more detail about the most important changes that have come through. But before we get there, I do kind of just want to step back and acknowledge that there is sort of a bigger trend, particularly around privacy, that's been developing for quite some time. And I think it's just really important for us to internalize that and to realize that these aren't one-off incidents. These aren't one-time changes. These are bigger things that we're going to be dealing with for years to come. So, it's no surprise, I think, to many of us that privacy has been an ongoing concern among consumers for quite some time. This is data from Pew Research. This is back from 2019, which seems like it was forever ago. But they regularly survey Americans about their attitudes towards technology and media. And in their latest survey, which is in 2019, 70% of Americans said that they felt their data was less secure than it was 5 years ago. And 8 in 10 said that they were concerned about the amount of information that social media sites and advertisers know about them. So as marketers and advertisers, we are operating in this environment. We have to stay aware of those developing attitudes because, as I think we'll discuss sort of at length, they are having a direct impact on our day-to-day work. Even if on an individual level, we do support these changes and think that ultimately they're a good thing. But, just kind of in a lighthearted way, when I see this sort of data and this sort of information coming out of Pew, it makes me think of, David Ogilvy, the father of modern advertising, and what he might say if he were alive today. He never said this, that marketers ruin everything, but I think he might if he had been around today. So, David Ogilvy quotes on advertising, kind of like Mark Twain quotes on the internet, by the way. He attribute all sorts of stuff to him. But so it's against that kind of larger backdrop, right? This kind of larger trend around concerns around privacy that I think it's really no surprise that we have been seeing and will continue to see a host of privacy related sort of developments. And I think what's important here is to realize that this is not one group. This is not one organization. It is a broader movement that's going to be with us. So many of you were paying attention, of course, to GDPR when that came out back in 2018. Some of you may have been tuned into the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, 2018. You may be familiar with some of these products that you're seeing here, the logos for the Brave browser, which is sort of a no tracking, very privacy focused web browser that's been gaining traction. DuckDuckGo, which is a privacy focused alternative to Google. Safari and Apple, of course, have been privacy focused for quite some time. We'll talk about that in even products, like Proton VPN, which is very easy to use service that masks your internet and sort of browsing traffic. Lots of people are releasing tools on that. They're gaining traction. They're becoming a lot more popular. And, so it's not like this is being sort of driven by any one organization. From a higher ed perspective, I think it's also worth noting that in addition to all these sort of privacy related changes that are impacting our digital marketing, we also have some very higher ed specific changes. And one of them is the impact on student search. So back in our first webinar, Gareth Fowles, who's the VP of enrollment at Lynn University down in Florida, brought up sort of an interesting point. And it was around, we were talking about test optional, schools going test optional. And what he said was that, in February 2020, 77% of applications that came through the Common App included an SAT or ACT score. This past February, that number fell to 44%. So in Gareth's words, that sort of, number one, he said that the test optional movement is real. We need to know that. And it's very attractive for some schools. And it's likely that some schools that went test optional because of COVID are not going back. And so that is going to have sort of a direct impact on our search strategy. So if you have been accustomed to having robust student lists from search and folding those into your digital campaigns, that's going to be a less powerful strategy. So it's not like we can pivot away from Facebook and then lean in more on a smarter search strategy. That also has been compromised. So all that is to say, there's been some major changes. Don't pretend to have all the answers for you today on this webinar to sort of tie it up with a perfect bow, but I do think we have some very practical things you can do to maintain effectiveness and begin to pivot as we sort of enter this new terrain. So let's talk about just kind of where we are. One sort of piece that came in and I think hit our radar from a privacy standpoint a couple of years ago, back in 2018, was GDPR, which, as a quick reminder, created sort of a series of very sweeping changes related to data collection and transparency and portability, specifically focused on EU citizens. I remember quite well being at a conference for the American Association of College Registrars and Admissions Officers, and there was a ton of concern in a lot of the sessions about how schools could possibly comply with GDPR in light of our own regulations stateside, and that clearly GDPR was sort of put together with companies like Facebook and Google in mind, but not so much, your typical college or university that has many other sort of data and information related requirements to comply with. I think what was interesting was that there was some speculation that this could lead to lawsuits, schools, and to my knowledge, that hasn't happened. I'm sure somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, but with regard to GDPR and stateside schools, I think the biggest impact, honestly, for us as marketers was that, a lot of us have been putting cookie notifications and opt-ins and opt-outs on our websites. And so those cookie banners kind of popped up all of a sudden. Similarly, stateside, we have CCPA, California Consumer Privacy Act of 2018. Didn't hear about this nearly as much. Maybe your individual school, you heard some conversation around that. But I think that was came out at the same time, but hit fewer radars because it has primarily been targeted at for-profit companies, who meet certain criteria. Of course, I'm a marketer, I'm not a lawyer, so please don't take my commentary on that as sort of clearance that it doesn't apply to your school. Certainly talk to your own in-house counsel about that, but I think that's realistically kind of where we ended up. So wrapping up on this, I think the key takeaway is that there are, these laws are a clear indicator. There's more to come. As we speak, there are more privacy-related proposals working their way through state legislatures around the country. And it seems inevitable that at some point we're going to have some sort of our own federal data privacy law at some point. So, of course, it really wasn't legislation that hit us so hard in 2021. It was some big moves made particularly by Apple, our heaviest of the technology heavyweights that we sort of hear about. Of sort of the big tech companies, Apple, Facebook, Google, Amazon, Apple has really positioned itself as sort of being the most on the forefront of privacy. And this really isn't a new move for Apple. If you follow them closely, Steve Jobs was pretty public before he died about Apple having sort of more confused, he called them old-fashioned views on privacy. And they've gone to bat for that in some real ways. You probably remember the shootings in San Bernardino back in 2015, and the FBI reached out to Apple saying, hey, can you unlock this iPhone? And they said, no, we will not unlock the iPhone. But this year, I think Apple made it clear that they're not backing down on privacy. And if anything, they're going to double down on it. And I do think it's really worth thinking about that for a moment. That the richest, most influential tech company in the world is going head to head with other tech companies on privacy and by extension, advertising. So as an individual, I'm happy to see this, but as a marketer and advertiser, it's kind of a pain because I think we have reason to believe that Apple isn't going to stop here. This isn't sort of a fad for them. And And the reason I think that is because ultimately, I think this is about competition. If you look where Apple drives its revenue, it's all off devices and a little bit on services. But two of its largest competitors, Facebook and Google, are heavily, the majority of the revenue comes from advertising. So I think that this is sort of a way for them to differentiate themselves and also point out weaknesses in two key competitors. So for those reasons, although I think there's some sincerity behind, some principles seem to be operating behind what they're doing, I think this is a long-term strategic bet for Apple that's going to continue to have impact to us. So what has Apple done so far? Well, they've kind of had a history of some privacy-related updates, started with Safari. Back in 2017, Apple implemented the intelligent tracking prevention, sort of 1.0, that began imposing some limits on third-party cookies. So for those, just as a quick reminder for anyone who might not be familiar, third-party cookies are really sort of the technological backbone, the keystone that sort of enables personalized advertising. So essentially with third-party cookies, little files that exist on your browser, they allow advertisers and ad tech companies and others to track your visits across multiple websites. So if I visit website A and website A has Google tracking installed, and then tomorrow I go back and visit website B, and it also has Google tracking involved, then Google can start stitching together a picture of who I am and what my interests are based on my browsing habits and other information. So that data then becomes available to people using Google's advertising platforms who want to advertise to people who meet my particular profile. So without third-party cookies, that kind of tracking is essentially impossible with the technology that we have today. We'll talk more about some alternatives that are being proposed, but as of today, if third-party cookies were to go away, none of that would be possible at all. So in 2019, Apple launched ITP 2.0, put some further restrictions on cookies and how cookies are stored locally. And then in 2020, their Safari browser started blocking all third-party cookies outright, as well as device fingerprinting, which was has been an alternative to cookie tracking. And just in short, device fingerprinting essentially allows the web server or ad tech company to look at your individual device, the specific characteristics, what software you have running, that sort of thing, and basically create a unique fingerprint. So two people could have the exact same sort of hardware or laptop, but have different software and different items running in the background that an advertiser could look at and kind of fingerprint, quote unquote, your device. So in 2021, and that's where the big sort of tectonic shift came in, was in an Apple iPhone update, iOS 14.5, which introduced two sort of key updates: the app tracking transparency update and the privacy click measurement update. And those two are worth understanding in greater detail. And we're going to dive into those because unlike the Safari updates, which were on a browser that was popular but never the market leader, these changes to iPhone are significant and have had an impact on your campaigns because iPhone has the largest market share of smartphone users in the US. So it's a big deal for that reason. So let's kind of look at a little bit closer what came through with the app tracking, transparency, and private click measurement updates. So first up, app tracking transparency, or ATT. This is a move that applies specifically to iPhone apps. And essentially what ATT does is it requires each app to ask your permission to use the unique identifier for advertisers that Apple has assigned you. So the first time, and it happens the first time you open the app, and it prompts you with this prompt. You've probably seen this on your iPhone if you're an iPhone user, things like this that basically say, do you want to allow the tracking? And it allows you, the user, on an individual basis to choose whether or not you want to allow that particular app to track you. So this update sent a lot of folks in a tailspin because app publishers were able to use their apps to track a lot of activity about what you were doing on your phone. From what other apps you might have had installed, to your browsing behavior, your activity data, and they were able to send that all back to their app publisher, who could then turn around and send it to sell it to other folks who wanted to make use of that data. So this was a big one. One that Facebook was not at all happy about, because you can guess most folks, or a significant percentage of folks at the very least, are opting out of this. The second update was private click measurement, or PCM for short. And this has more to do with attribution. So it's a little bit more under the hood for advertisers. But essentially, previously advertisers, we've been pretty spoiled with pretty long attribution windows, meaning that if somebody clicked on our ad or saw our ad and didn't convert immediately, but then did later come back and convert, maybe 90 days later, up to 180 days later after they clicked or saw the ad, then we can measure that and we could attribute that back to the ad that they clicked on or the ad that they saw. With PCM, essentially Apple has shortened that window of attribution to just 7 days. And for view-through attributions, where someone sees the ad, but sees it, but doesn't click on it, but still goes and converts, that window has been shortened to 1 day. So that's a huge change. This has impacted Facebook's tracking sort of immediately. I'm sure that many of you here on this call had to go through the process of sort of quickly registering your domain if you were using Facebook pixels to keep your business manager up and keep your Facebook advertising running after that iOS update came out. So in response to this, Facebook has not been happy about it. They implemented aggregated event management is what they call it, which is basically their answer to Apple on how are we going to track iPhone users converting on ads. So, in the past, you could have Facebook pixels sprinkled all over your website. You could have all sorts of events and things that you could send back to Facebook that Facebook could use to further optimize your ads. And you could, it's kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet of tracking. With aggregated event management, essentially Facebook has narrowed that down to 8 events, and you have to prioritize those events. So if multiples happen, it's only going to report back on one. So I think for a lot of folks in higher ed, that wasn't necessarily a huge deal, but for a lot of advertisers, it was to sort of narrow down those 8 conversion events and really kind of simplify things. So depending on how you've had your campaigns running and set up, that may or may not have been a really big deal for you, but it definitely was some sort of administrative legwork at the very least. And these sort of changes have definitely impacted your reporting. So I'm sure you've probably noticed sort of just less detail overall, more unknowns in your reports, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. So I think despite all of Facebook's very public objections over Apple's iOS 14 update, they too have not been immune from making privacy changes. Of course, if you follow Facebook at all, sort of for years, they have been coming under fire for privacy and mental health concerns, particularly for teen users. So some really gnarly headlines out there. Ultimately on August 23rd, Facebook launched some pretty significant restrictions on how advertisers can target teen users on Facebook, Instagram, and Messenger. So sort of that key demo of 13 to 17. And this is one that I think has really hit us hard in higher ed, and that we really need to think about how we're going to pivot. Because in the past, Facebook gave you a lot of options for targeting minors, high school students. So we had things like age, gender, location, but I think more importantly, we had things like interests, or list membership. So we could take that student search list, we could upload it to Facebook, we could match on a large percentage of those folks, and then we had this custom audience that we could use to create lookalike audiences, and we could do a lot with that. So what that meant from an advertising standpoint was that you could afford to advertise over a pretty broad, pretty generic geographic area, but you could narrow it down through interest-based targeting or through your custom audience targeting. Now, with Facebook's update, that came out in August, none of that is possible. Essentially, you have three options, which are age, gender, and location. Those are your three targeting options for Facebook. So no interests, no first party lists, no remarketing for folks in that demographic. So that's a big change. And, of course, not only does this impact Facebook, I keep saying Facebook, but I think we all realize it's really Facebook, Instagram, Messenger. It's all part of the same advertising sort of ecosystem or platform. So there's some pretty significant changes. Google also in August released, sort of announced its own updates, and these are rolling out and continuing to roll out, but some pretty significant changes on Google's advertising products. So some of these haven't rolled out yet. I believe, for instance, right now in Google, you could still upload a list of first-party data that you have and match against that, but that is going to be going away. Google's updates, I think, are a lot more sweeping. They have gone farther, and they're impacting more of its products. So, YouTube, paid search, their display advertising. You are not allowed to target specifically on age, gender, location. We'll talk about contextual targeting because I think that's super interesting and a good way to sort of pivot away from this type of targeting. But interests, first party list remarketing, all that's gone for that particular demographic. And if it's not now, it will be in the coming months. So that's more or less where we are now. But I do think there are a couple of things on the horizon that we need to be paying attention to that will impact us within the coming months and within the next couple of years. So I think there are just some very predictable sort of tactical things that we can expect as more and more people are using privacy-focused products that sort of make cookie-based tracking less effective, and as more and more major companies get on board with these privacy changes. So the first one is, I think that over the short to medium term, we have remarketing lists right now, but I think we're going to see those remarketing lists continue to shrink and get smaller and smaller over time. I think that, similar to what Apple did with attribution windows, we could probably expect that we're going to see some shorter attribution windows, not just for iPhone users, but for other products as well. Third, I think that we're going to necessarily need to pivot to more of a contextual based sort of advert or targeting strategy. And I'm going to talk more in a little bit, but I predict sort of a resurgence of contextual targeting. And just as a quick reminder, this is where ads are being displayed based on the context of what the user is doing. So the content on a particular web page, or if you're on YouTube, perhaps the content or description of a particular video, or maybe search terms that they've entered into YouTube, that would all be examples of contextual targeting. And again, we'll talk more about that in a minute. Fourth, I do think that we can expect to see more conversion modeling, and Facebook is already talking about this. So historically, we have tracked conversions by firing pixels. It wasn't necessarily 100% accurate. I'm sure if you are down in the weeds on advertising, you've seen, say, a mismatch on what Facebook is saying your conversions are versus what Google Analytics might be saying your conversions are. Haven't been 100% consistent and accurate, but it was based on an actual sort of measurable event, a pixel firing or an event firing. With conversion modeling, essentially the ad platform is trying to stitch together what data they do have and apply whatever sort of black box algorithm they have to sort of predict or estimate what they think your conversions actually are. So it's just a really smart rocket sciencey best guess, but it's not actually based on a direct measurement. So I think we're going to see that. Facebook's already talking about that and doing some of that. I think you're going to see that happen more often. We may see more sort of aggregated conversion events similar to Facebook. We may see that happening on other platforms. And lastly, I think if you've been using any sort of third-party data providers, Nielsen, Axiom, those sort of come to mind, they're going to need to start finding different methods that aren't cookie-based in order to sort of gather those audiences. Which actually kind of takes me on a little bit of a segue to Google. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, we're sort of on this long-term march towards greater privacy. And one of the next major events that is on the horizon at some point is that Google will be phasing out all third-party cookies. That was initially planned for 2022, so just next year. But there hasn't really emerged any good alternative, that's going to satisfy tracking, advertisers tracking, and Google's revenue needs. So they've kicked the can down the road to 2023. But of course, marketers have dubbed this the Cookiepocalypse, which is a great name for it. But Cookiepocalypse is coming, and we will be in a post-cookie world at some point. And we just don't, I think we need to be careful that does not catch us on guard. There are some proposals, and Google has sort of been leading some of the charge on this with how are we going to replace cookies. And I don't know if these are actually going to happen. In fact, I think it's likely that the proposals they've thrown out there are not going to happen, at least not without some significant evolution, but it gives you an idea of the type of tracking that may become available down the road. So Google has put together a whole bunch of privacy related sort of proposals. They call it their privacy sandbox initiative, if you see that. And so there's a lot of proposals in that privacy sandbox initiative. Two that have been getting a lot of headlines and controversy are two proposals. One is called FLoC, which stands for Federated Learning Cohorts, and the other one is FLEDGE, First Locally Executed Decision Over Groups Experiment. Clearly, these were put together by Google engineers and not marketers, but they are worth kind of digging into and understanding, even if they aren't really catchy and memorable. So the first one, let's talk about FLoC, or the Federated Learning Cohorts. So essentially, this is one proposal to eliminate cookies. So the way cookies work today is that they are a little file on your browser that identifies each unique user with sort of an individual token. And so as you're browsing around, that cookie is sharing your information back to your advertiser, your publisher, your ad tech company, whoever it is that's tracking your activity. And if it's a third-party cookie, they're tracking you as you visit multiple websites. FLoC basically changes that. Your browsing information is still tracked, but it is processed entirely browser side. So it's all client side processing. And it is your browser that places you within a cohort or a group. And all it reveals back to the advertising platform is the cohort that you're in. So it doesn't say what specific websites you've been browsing. It just says, Jarrett Smith is a middle-aged male who's into fly fishing and mountain biking, and he's in that cohort. So we're just going to reveal the cohort. So I think FLoC is interesting for a couple of reasons. It's not actually, strictly speaking, a Google project. It's actually a Chromium project. So that means it's open source. And Google is working with the W3C, who sort of publishes web standards that people agree to adhere to. They're trying to make FLoC sort of the web standard. So far, Google has done some actual testing with this in a limited capacity. And what they're showing is that advertising based around FLoC is about 95% as effective or 95% as efficient as targeting with third-party cookies. So it is pretty darn good, but it is controversial. Not everybody's on board with that. There's a lot of controversy from publishers and some other really big tech heavy hitters. WordPress is one that's came out hard against FLoC, basically saying we're going to not support that on any WordPress powered websites, which is a huge portion of the web. And so there's a lot of work to be done there. It's probably not going to ever be implemented as it stands now, but it's interesting to at least give you an idea of how very smart engineers are thinking about sort of coming around this. FLEDGE is a similar system. And I think the takeaway here is that this is essentially the replacement for retargeting. So it works very similarly to Flock. The key difference is that advertisers are actually able to create their own core cohorts. So again, not being able to peer into what was someone's specific advertise or sort of browsing activity, but they can create their own cohort and advertise to that. So Google has begun rolling out some of these privacy sandbox initiatives, at least on some of its browsers. But again, I think we're still a long ways off from having it implemented, because many of these proposals are, as you can imagine, very controversial about who controls the information and how. So more certainly to come there that is worth paying attention to. So, okay, we've kind of looked at the current state of things. We've looked at some things that are sort of near future, I think. So let's talk about building effective campaigns and some practical steps. And I'll start with some things that I think are pretty tactical, and then we'll kind of leave you with a couple of things that I think are a little bit higher level, a little more strategic in nature. So the first one is that, if you've been watching this, you may have been contemplating, or if your school is advertising on Facebook, which I'm sure many of you are, or most of you, if not all of you are, you may have been contemplating, hey, should we just move away from Facebook altogether? I would caution you against moving away from Facebook altogether, and not totally write off Facebook just yet. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So it is true that if you're advertising to teenagers on Facebook, that you have given up a lot of control. You are no longer allowed to use some of those tried and true targeting methods that we've come to know and love. But I think we need to remember that a lot of Facebook targeting actually happened on the back end and was never in our control, and it was actually conducted by machine learning. So it's Facebook actually dialing in sort of in their machine learning black box, who's the most likely to respond to your ad, and how do we optimize for that? Facebook, that has not gotten shut down. The front end control that we have, yes, that's much of that is gone, but the back end sort of black boxy part of Facebook, that's still there. I think one way, sort of very tactically, that you can help out with this, sort of give Facebook the information it needs or give it a leg up, is that when you launch new Facebook campaigns, I would encourage you to consider launching an objective-driven campaign. So Facebook allows you to select an objective as you're setting up that campaign. I think that's a good step, so that you're essentially giving Facebook a specific goal to optimize against. That's something you can do that's very easy to sort of help out with that. The second thing is, I think you're really, from a tactical standpoint, just going to need to take a hard look at your geographic advertising or sort of targeting if you haven't done that already. So as I mentioned earlier, in the past, we could target very broadly geographically, and we could narrow it down through interests and layering on other sort of targeting criteria. Today, you're really going to want to rein that in. And I think really dial in on specific areas where you think you're going to have the most impact. So Facebook does allow targeting by zip code, and you can get pretty granular with that. So I think that's worth sort of a harder look and really making sure that you're in those geographic areas where you really think it makes the most sense and you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Related to that, though, speaking of sort of bang for your buck, I think one thing that, this is just speculation on my part, but one thing to keep in mind is that if advertisers start to see less attractive results from Facebook, then over time, sort of the market value, the cost per 1,000 impressions, your CPMs, probably will drop on Facebook. They will not be able to charge the sort of ever increasing CPMs that they have been. And so even though Facebook may ultimately lose some effectiveness, it might also become cheaper. And so it might still be worth it to maintain a foothold because it's just less expensive, and it all kind of evens out. That's sort of a market-driven thing. I have no idea. That's up obviously to somebody at a higher pay grade and greater responsibility than I am to determine that. But I think that's something we could actually see in the coming months or years. I would also encourage you not to forget about the audiences that you can still effectively target to a certain extent on Facebook, specifically parents, potential transfer students, graduate prospects. Those are all still much more addressable on Facebook. And so you're going to want to keep those campaigns running. Finally, and this is sort of a just sort of a tactical thing that you might consider playing around with is launching separate Android and iPhone campaigns so that you can really have more of an apples to apples comparison and kind of see what the measurement differences are between campaigns targeted at iPhone users and identical campaigns, but targeted at Android users. To be an interesting experiment that I think might be sort of instructive and helpful for you to do. So I mentioned contextual targeting. This is sort of another tactical thing that I would encourage you to really embrace. So contextual targeting is really one of the oldest forms of targeting ads. It's been around for over 100 years. And again, just as a quick reminder, this is where you are targeting your ad based on either the context of the ad, the surrounding content, maybe the video that is being consumed, or a search query that someone has entered into a search engine. So paid search is essentially contextual advertising. Someone searches for a particular term and you're showing your ad based on what they search for in the web pages that are appearing in the organic results down below. So search ads are contextually targeted, and so is YouTube. So you can, and this is a very powerful, very interesting way to target that's pretty well understood. If you haven't already heard this, it is interesting to note that YouTube is the second largest search engine, and everybody's using YouTube. It's widely adopted and extensively used by teenagers and our target prospective students. So I do think that leveraging YouTube's contextual targeting could be a great way for you to continue to reach those audiences. Now, Facebook, interestingly enough, has not historically allowed you to target contextually, at least in any sort of direct way that you could control on the front end. But it is interesting that back in July, Facebook's VP of advertising came out in a blog post and said, hey, we're looking at contextual advertising and building that into our platform. Now, he really didn't say if that would be something you would be able to control directly, or if that would happen in sort of Facebook's machine learning black box, sort of on the back end. But I think these are all related. Facebook's it's conceivable down the road to offer up some interesting contextual targeting options for you in your advertisements. So certainly worth paying attention to and folding into your campaigns if you haven't already started doing so. The next sort of tactical thing I would say is that if you aren't currently serious about your UTM tracking, you need to get serious about your UTM tracking. So this is the sort of query string that you can add on to URLs and that Google Analytics and other platforms can read to understand sort of campaign source information and where did that click come from. The important thing to really operationalizing this across the team is to, one, agree on some consistent, very locked in naming conventions that everybody agrees to. And then you're going to want to operationalize that with, probably with something like a Google Sheet. There's a ton of free ones out there, by the way, that are UTM builders. If you just search for something like a Google Sheet UTM builder, something along those lines, you probably get a ton of listings. But what you can do then is have your team plug in the destination URL and then select the different parts of the UTM code from a series of drop downs, and so that they can build consistently that way, and then you can pull through on your reporting. If you aren't collecting UTM information, if you're using it but you aren't collecting on your RFI forms, that's a great way to get that UTM information into your CRM if you're not already doing so. So I'd encourage you to set that up, work with your CRM folks to get that rolling if you haven't done so already. So a little bit stepping back, this is somewhat tactical, but a little bit of a shift in focus. I think it's worth thinking about first-party data and how you can do a better job collecting first-party data on your website. So a lot of what we've been talking about, the real challenges from privacy standpoint around third-party data, which we need to achieve scale and reach. But first-party data is the data that you're getting for free and that your audience is voluntarily contributing, giving to you. So RFI forms are really one of the key places where you're going to capture your first-party data. From marketing standpoint, it's kind of the key place. And so I think I don't really have any data to back this up, but just sort of anecdotally, it seems that I've seen a growing percentage of RFI forms that have some sort of incentivization lever that they're trying to pull in it, whether that's download a brochure that shares more details on the curriculum than maybe what's on the landing page, or this one over here on the right is a content offer. Sort of very classic content offer where it's cybersecurity career guide in exchange for a little bit of first-party information. So I think you're going to see this sort of thing becoming more common, and you may want to experiment with that within your campaigns to see if it sort of ups the value of what people hope to get by filling out your forms. One really interesting example that I also think that is kind of a different take on this is by providing the option, but not the requirement to provide additional information on an RFI form. So this is an RFI form off Messiah EDU. I'm going to give them credit for this. This is, I did an interview with Chris Hardy, who's the director of web and digital marketing at Messiah EDU, really smart guy. And he had experimented with this on their RFI forms, and it's still there today. So essentially on their RFI form, you have sort of the usual stuff, email address, first name, last name, high school grad year, those sorts of details. But the last question is this one, and it says, in order to better serve you and send you printed materials, are you willing to provide us with more information? And so Chris launched this as an experiment, and he said, I really didn't think anybody was going to click on it and fill it out, but surprisingly, yes, they did. And when you do click on that, it expands a whole laundry list of additional fields. None of them are required, obviously. Starts with address, which he said that's mostly what people plug in there. They want to receive printed materials. So it starts with address, but then it digs into more detailed information around, parent, guardian, first name, last name, email address, need some additional information. And so, yes, most people just fill out the address, but a surprising percentage of students do provide lots of other information that's useful for you in your marketing program. So I think this is sort of representative of kind of a different philosophical approach in a way of what you might sort of call permission-based marketing. I didn't come up with that term. I think came across that with Mark Schaefer. May have created that term. If not, I'm sure someone will correct me. But permission-based marketing, where essentially you're allowing the consumer, your target audience, to opt into how much they want to share, and you're giving them control and sort of putting them in the driver's seat. On our side of the house, we've been experimenting with folding that kind of approach into our email comms flows for our clients. And still early to sort of share how that's working out, but it is interesting, and we have seen great engagement when we give people more of a choice and more agency in determining what and how they want to share. So those are some very tactical things that I think it makes sense to do in the immediate term. I do want to wrap up by talking about some bigger picture things as you're thinking about your total media mix and looking out over a little bit more of a longer term perspective. And the first thing I want to leave you with, I think we kind of want to go back to sort of first principles here. And so what I would say is that first, awareness really matters. It is hard to measure. It's frustratingly hard to measure your awareness-focused media, but we do know that awareness matters. And at the end of the day, very few students are going to be engaging with ads from schools that they've never heard of before. This kind of came up, I recall, in R&L's e-expectations report back in 2018, where they said, they surveyed a large swath of high school students, and only 12% of seniors said that they had clicked on ads for institutions they didn't know. So that's very telling. And this is something that is also reiterated throughout the advertising and marketing literature from non-higher ed folks. This is a sort of a trend that remains true. People click on ads of organizations that they recognize. So, essentially, it may be really frustratingly hard to measure the value of those billboards, but you have to remember, you're not just advertising to people searching for a college right now. You're advertising to people who are searching for a college 2 years from now, or the parents of someone, or parents or guardians of someone searching for college 2 years from now. That's who your awareness media is targeted at. So really, it's sort of that long-term play. The second thing I would sort of ground us in is that we have to remember that media channels do not operate in a vacuum. There is sort of a cross-channel synergy that people have studied. And I can't believe I just used that word synergy non-ironically, but I did. There it is. I said it. So, this is something that big brands, big advertisers have known for a long time and have studied closely. This is a particular piece of data that was pulled forward by Applied Brand Science, really interesting consultancy. And they were touting sort of the benefits of TV. I'm not going to tell you need to buy a Super Bowl commercial, but I think the key here is that when you run advertising across multiple channels, they are complementary, and there is a sort of greater than the individual parts kind of effect that happens, and you need to keep that in mind. The other thing I would say is that your prospective students are not operating in a vacuum either. There are, parents and guardians, likely, mom, that is having a huge influence over college search. We're going to be talking about that in our next webinar. Beyond the immediate family, you have school counselors, you have employers, you have friends that are also providing guidance and some influence on this decision. So I think that when we obsess too much over really granularly target advertising, I do think we're kind of doing ourselves a disservice, because we may be missing some of these other folks who are really influential in the process when we could be capturing them in our campaigns. So it's not necessarily out of the gate a bad thing to have a somewhat broader campaign. I think there can be value in it as long as the costs line up. But while we're talking first principles, I want to go back to the one that impacts us all, which is that you do not have unlimited budget, and I recognize you cannot afford to sort of feed like a whale. So you have limited resources. You need to deploy them in a way that you're accountable for, and that you can feel good about. So a couple of things that I would leave you with. Number one, I really urge you to focus on owning your own backyard. And if you're trying to create awareness in new markets, which many folks are, that you're just very strategic and very thoughtful about geographically how you're doing it, how you're targeting those ads. When you really focus on owning your own backyard and your sort of core market where you are already the most known and the most likely to succeed, it really allows you to focus those limited advertising dollars. And if you start layering on multiple advertising channels, it allows you to create more of that sort of cross-channel synergy. So I strongly urge you to do that. And just in terms of, a quick and dirty way of kind of thinking about how do we know our own backyard, although I'm sure you have the institutional research enrollment data to know this, but one way I like to look at that is through Google Trends. So here's comparing two schools, Colorado College and Sewanee University of the South, and you look at where does Google searches for these schools come from? Colorado College and Sewanee have very different geographies, which makes sense. So you need to be thinking about that, I think, a little more seriously if you haven't been already. The second thing is, I think we sort of need to expand our platform mix and sort of broaden our palette in terms of the advertising platforms we're using. So I think we tend to get very narrowed in on paid search, probably Google products, Facebook and Instagram and those sorts of things, but others are valuable and worth looking at. Right now, as of today, TikTok and Snapchat allow you that more granular targeting that you're used to having on Facebook, and allow you to upload first-party lists, so you can target that way. So I think those, obviously you need to be careful, because the creative considerations for TikTok and Snapchat are not the same as they are on Facebook. It's a different creative approach, but from a targeting standpoint, those two are viable I think things worth folding into your campaign, and to see if they make sense and can generate results for you. Paid search, I think, if you don't already have a really robust paid search strategy, you should. That's going to become even more important, I think. And then sort of a contextual option here, college search websites like Niche talk about contextual targeting. These, I think need to be part of your media diet if they aren't already. YouTube and OTT, or now it's connected TV is kind of the term du jour, but connected TV and YouTube, I think, are also worth taking a look at. There are connected TV vendors that are doing some interesting things with device-specific targeting or IP targeting that may allow you to address your audiences in new ways and do so affordably. So you can have sort of a cable-like TV buy, but much more targeted and much more cost efficient. YouTube, I know I've talked about YouTube a little bit already with regard to contextual targeting, but I came across a stat the other day. I want to say 50% of YouTube videos are actually consumed on a connected TV. So, and that is validated by what my kids are watching on our TV. It's mostly YouTube. So I think that becomes an interesting play when you think of that as more of almost like akin sort of next door neighbors to more of a traditional TV buy in some ways. And lastly, I think we need to look at some other, more old-fashioned options. NPR is one that I think consistently has a very specific audience that can be right for some programs. It tends to be more cost-effective. It is good old-fashioned terrestrial radio, but it is oftentimes appropriately priced and does make sense for some of your programs and audiences the influential audiences that you're trying to address. So, who knows what's around the corner? I encourage you to stay nimble. That old saying, cliche that changes the only constant. It really is true, particularly in digital advertising. So I just encourage you guys, keep moving, keep evolving, and hang in there. Keep doing the good work that you're doing. So with that in mind, with all that said, just want to say thank you. If you care to reach out with questions, you can reach me at jarrett@echodelta.co. Love to continue the conversation. And shameless plug, if you aren't already listening to the Higher Ed Marketing Lab podcast, I encourage you to do so. So I hope to see you on next week's webinar. It's been a pleasure sharing with you today, and take care. We'll be sending out the replay in an email soon.